When we look at the volume of the slave trade, between 12 and 16 million slaves were taken out of Africa to the Americas during the period of this Atlantic slave trade. And when you look at where the slaves went, about 40% went to Brazil alone. And another 40 to 42% went to the Caribbean region. Only about 2 to 5% of all slaves brought to the Americas actually went to North America. So, as plantations grew, so too did the dependency on slave labor in the Americas. And most of the American economies revolved around cash crops. And so in the Caribbean, they grew large amounts of sugar, and later, by the end of this era, coffee. But sugar was by far, at the beginning of this period, the most lucrative cash crop. And so these plantations tended to specialize in a single cash crop. In the modern day United States, tobacco was a key cash crop, especially in the middle colonies. And then in the southern colonies, rice and cotton plantations. And so plantations were racially divided, with usually a few white overseers at the top of this pyramid. And we see this especially in the Caribbean, where your ratio may be 90% slaves and only 10% whites. Now, in North America, that ratio was more balanced. In fact, oftentimes you would only have about 20% or so of your population actually be slaves. But in the Caribbean and parts of Latin America, that ratio could be as high as 90%. And so whites were at the top, and then you did have a small class of free peoples of color. And then at the bottom were your slaves. And even your slaves were divided into two categories. You had your Creole slaves. These were slaves that had been born in the Americas, sometimes of mixed parentage. And then at the bottom, you had your saltwater slaves. These were slaves brought directly from Africa to the Americas. And so when we look at the volume of the slave trade, the reason why the volume was so high and why we needed this constant influx of new slaves to the Americas was the death rates were really high, especially in parts of the Caribbean and Brazil. And this was due to harsh treatment and also tropical diseases. And there were also very few families, slave families, that were created in the Caribbean and Brazil. There weren't many women brought to those regions. And so you didn't have a large number of slave families that were created. And so because of this, they had to have this constant importation of new slaves. And that's why most of the slaves brought to the Americas continued to go to the Caribbean and to Brazil. When we look at North America, only about 5% of slaves were brought to North America. And between 1 and 2% actually came to the modern day United States. And that was because in those areas, we saw more female slaves brought, and that led to more slave families and kind of natural population growth right in the Americas, so that they didn't have to constantly import new slaves to the United States. When we look at the impact that slavery had in the Americas, as more and more slaves were brought from Africa to the Americas, they brought with them their culture. And that culture is going to mix with the culture and traditions here in the Americas. And that's going to lead to things like new languages. The African and Creole languages are going to be brought, blending several African languages together or blending with native languages as well. We're going to see them bring their religions as well, their religious beliefs. And so African Christianity was very different from Christianity in the Americas. And so they brought those beliefs with them and incorporated it into their religious practices here in the Americas. For example, in African religion, there was a lot more singing and dancing and drumming, and they even created some syncretic religions where they brought their traditional African beliefs with them over here. And that's going to lead to things like voodoo in Haiti or Santeria in Cuba. They brought with them at times their practices of magic and sorcery and animal sacrifice as well. We're also going to see them bring other cultural traditions, things like their food. For example, gumbo is a hybrid cuisine that comes from a syncretic mixing of African and then native cuisine. They're also going to bring with them their weaving and their pottery. And so many aspects of African culture are going to be brought over to the Americas. When we look at the end of the slave trade, first off, there was some resistance to slavery. Some slaves would work slow as a form of revolt, or they might sabotage equipment or destroy equipment to get them a break and mess up labor. Some actually escaped, and there were maroon colonies that were created from escaped slaves. But overall, as far as slave revolts go, slave revolts were extremely rare, and that's because when they did happen, they were usually brutally put down by plantation owners. And so over time, gradually, we see more resistance to slavery and the slave trade. And that was due to a wide variety of new ideas that were spreading in Europe. The Enlightenment is going to help kind of start this conversation. And as Enlightenment ideals spread, that helped spread ideas of freedom. Also, the French Revolution is going to play a role, and the other revolutions as well. But as part of the French Revolution, they're actually going to end slavery. And so that's going to play a small role as well. We're also going to see slave journals begin to spread. And these slave journals, and a couple of the more famous ones, Olaudah Equiano is going to publish a famous slave journal. But what they did is they exposed the brutality of slavery to the public. And so Frederick Douglass, another one who used his newspaper to help spread the brutality of slavery. And also, slavery simply became more costly. The price of slaves continued to increase. You also had a situation to where the price of crops was declining, especially sugar. So much sugar was being produced that the price of sugar declined. And so it got to a point to where it was actually cheaper to pay people to work rather than purchase slaves. And so these are things that are going to help pave the way for the eventual end of the slave trade. And then instead of exploiting Africa for slaves, Europe is going to exploit Africa for raw materials. So when we look at the end of the slave trade, most European states are going to abolish the slave trade early in the 19th century. And then after that, gradually, we're going to see the abolition of slavery. Most European states will abolish slavery between the late 1700s and the very early 1800s. The British colonies would abolish slavery in the 1830s. Most of the French colonies are going to abolish slavery in the 1840s. In the United States, of course, it wouldn't come until after the Civil War in 1865. And then Brazil would be the last to abolish slavery, and that wasn't until 1888. And so even after the end of the Atlantic slave trade, the Trans-Sahara and the Muslim slave trade would continue. And that slave trade is going to continue all the way until the late 1800s.